All right. So it's my great pleasure to welcome our second keynote speaker, Susan Murphy. Susan is, I guess, like me, a statistician with a machine learning bent. She's a joint professor she's jointly appointed in the statistics and CS department at Harvard since fall of last year. Before that, she spent quite a bit of time as a professor at University of Michigan. Susan has a bunch of awards, including she's been elected to the National Academy of Sciences. She received the MacArthur Genius Award, and she was an editor of the Annals of Statistics. So Susan has made fundamental contributions to experimental design, where she came up with smart randomized trials. It's also a very smart acronym, I'd say. And she's been recently interested in making, well, actually, I guess that's a natural continuation. She's been interested in making sequential decision-making in mobile health, and I think she's going to talk to us a little bit about that. And just maybe as a bit of an anecdote, so if you if you chat with Susan after 2 minutes, you notice that not only she has a bubbly personality, but she's actually a very avid and serious hockey player. And she'll talk to you about that, so if you watch hockey. All right, so without further ado, please help me welcome Susan.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And don't make the same mistake Sasha makes, because if he starts talking about hockey, I don't talk about anything else. I forget. So our group is involved with a number of different types of trials. These are trials in mobile health. These are sequential decision-making problems. And I'm going to go through a number of them, and I'm going to start with the simplest and go to the more sophisticated in terms of algorithmic development. So I want to introduce mobile health. So this is an area that spans behavioral science, reinforcement learning, and experimental design, statistical experimental design. And the idea is you want to promote behavior change and maintain behavior change. And this is non-trivial. If you're familiar with most of society's ills, much of our problems, our long-term problems stem from behavior, our own behaviors. And I give you some examples up at the top of different types of behaviors. So the idea is to assist the individual in achieving that individual's own long-term goals, help them change their behavior so in future they're better. And of course you want to help develop causal behavioral science. This is a field that's quite immature. So in mobile health, there's two types of actions or treatments that can be provided. They're called pushes and pulls. All mobile health interventions or apps contain tons of pulls. This is just content that's on the phone. You can go at any time, access it. For example, if you're struggling with alcoholism, at any time you look at your phone, you see the nearest and time and location of Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. So there's always tons of this type of pulls. The other type of action, of treatment action, is a push. And this is where you have to think more sequentially in time. So in a push, the app, either a wearable or your smartphone or an iPad or something of that type, a digital device, interrupts you in your life and tries to attempt to provide some sort of support to you, some sort of treatment. So as you can well imagine, this can be incredibly aggravating, and the long-term consequences can be quite negative. So here's a setting where you have to really trade off short and long-term decision-making when you talk about pushes. And today we're going to focus mainly on pushes. So I'm going to start off, like I said, with the simplest cases. So we've developed this trial that we call a micro-randomized trial, and now there's quite a few in the field. Here's a short definition. So these are trials in which you have a number of different factors, and each factor is a type of treatment. And so I use the word factorial experimental design. You'll see an example on the next slide. And the exploration in all of these settings is explicitly controlled. What do I mean by explicit? That means you can calculate the probability of an action being selected. And we're going to see shortly that some of this exploration is guided via online predictions. As time goes on, we're getting closer and closer to the reinforcement learning algorithms. There's always multiple treatment factors going on, and there's multiple pulls as well. And the thing to realize is that they're occurring at different time scales, and they target different rewards. So there'll be treatments that are provided during the day and targeting rewards that are very close in time, and there'll be treatments that might be provided any given day, once a day, treatments that might be provided weekly, all targeting different reward structures. And in each case, there's some long-term objective you want to accomplish. Almost always, there's a probabilistic budget on the number of treatment pushes you can provide. And this is mainly because of this recognition that these treatment pushes are very aggravating. They can be very aggravating. And also, not only can they be aggravating, you habituate. So if you've ever downloaded a mobile app, you'll know what I mean. After a while, you don't even see the push that arrives to you. You just don't see it, and that's called habituation. So what the science does is they're so concerned about this is they impose a budget on, say, an average number of pushes per day or pushes per week or pushes per hour. It just depends on the scenario. And that budget comes from the science. Ideally, of course, our algorithms would be so good that we wouldn't need this budget. And there's always an interest in off-policy learning. In these settings, it's all exploration. We'll see that shortly. And here, all the learning occurs off-policy. And it has to be causal inference. So the whole issue of causal inference in a in a reinforcement learning setting, it really comes to the fore. And a lot of thought has to be, I'm sure some of you are familiar with Pearl's work. It's really easy in a sequential setting to mess up the causal inference all by yourself. The data's fine. You produce non-causal inference because you manage the data inappropriately. So one has to take care in this setting. So here's a study. This study, the data is being analyzed right now, and the reason why I'm showing it to you is because I just want to highlight several issues. So first of all, there were 2 treatment factors that were randomized at the beginning of the study. So this is like old-timey experimental design. So it's 2 types of ways to set goal, one with more variability, one with less variability. Variability is supposed to promote engagement. And different types of daily goals. So each person could be in one of the 4 cells. And then, now, this is fine and good, but the interesting things are the randomizations that occur in real time over this is a formal study. So there was a randomization at each of 5 times a day. And this here, the budget was around 1.5 pushes per day. And so this is a very simple case. You just take 1.5 divided by 5, and you know what the randomization is. So there's no algorithms working at all right now. And the randomization is to a message that the content of which is tailored to the context the person finds themselves in. Often the content of these messages is produced by an algorithm. In this case, it wasn't, but in a lot of our settings, an algorithm informs the content of the message. And then there was also a randomization in the morning as well. But the point I want to make to you is that you have different actions occurring at different time scales. 2 of them at the very beginning, and it just stays that way for the whole 4 months. Others multiple times per day, others once per day. And in fact, there were even more in this study. It's just we simplified it to make this picture. And then you see the occurrence of the budget. Around 1.5 pushes per day out of 5 opportunities. So as I said, that study, it's done. The data is being analyzed. This study's still in the field. This one uses a lot more algorithms. There's an enormous amount of algorithms and a lot of engineering going on in this study. So this is a 10-day study for people who are trying to quit smoking. And they're wearing 2 wristbands, and they're wearing a chest band. And This is meant to inform, the purpose of this study is to develop the behavioral sciences. But nonetheless, it has this sequential decision-making aspect to it. So what happens is every minute of the whole day, it's 12-hour days for the 10 days following the quit attempt, there's a classification of whether or not the individual is currently physiologically stressed. So actually there's 3 options. You can't make a classification. You can classify the person as stressed, and you can classify them as not stressed. So those are the 3 options. And then that algorithm is an older algorithm. For an algorithm to go into a health-related field, it has to receive a lot of validation. This algorithm was based on a support vector machine. So then my role, that was done by, that classification algorithm was done by collaborators. My role is the algorithm that runs the randomization. So let me show you here. So every minute that a person was classified as stressed or not, they could be reminded that they have this intervention content on the phone. It's about how you can be more mindful and relax so that you don't experience stress, and then slide up. Many people smoke to manage stress. Okay, so this is all related. Okay, so in this simplification, I either provide you a reminder to access that intervention on the phone, or I don't. So I either interrupt you or I don't. And I can do it at any minute of the day. And the budget here is around 1.5 times per day when you're not stressed, and around 1.5 times per day, average of 1.5 times per day when you are stressed. So think about the kind of algorithm that has to go on. What happens is every time the person is detected, they reach a minute where they're detected as stressed, at that time you forecast the remaining number of times they're likely to be stressed over the remainder part of the day. You use that forecast to determine how the probability with which you give a reminder to access the support. And the reason why you're doing that is you want to do off-policy learning afterwards, and you want to understand, well, maybe in certain contexts, maybe when you're by yourself and you're stressed, it's useful to provide a reminder, but it's not when you're in a social setting and you're stressed. So you want to learn which context it's better to provide this push and which it's not. So you want to spread the pushes, that budget of 1.5, across all stress times throughout the day. And to do that, you have an algorithm. So we built a very simplistic prediction algorithm. Actually, we built a really sophisticated one. Wow, sophisticated for me. It was going to personalize using a sort of a stabilized gradient ascent on each individual, and we were not allowed to use it in the end because there was too many algorithms running on the phone. Because there's all these sensor streams being processed in real time on the phone. So we ended up using a very simple algorithm. It's the same forecasting algorithm for every single person. The great thing about it, when you have explicit randomization, is that provides a lot of robustness. So after the fact, we can go back and measure a lot of things. We can use the data that was recorded. Okay, so the minute you see this, you're already seeing an algorithm being used in real time to do sequential experimentation. The goal is not learning, it's all exploitation, it's all about collecting data. But immediately you might have in your mind, well, we should be able to learn as well in this type of a setting. That is, as the person goes through the study, we should be able to learn in what context is best to push versus not. And that is, of course, the next step. And so I want to talk to you about some of the challenges you confront when you start to go down that path. But one thing I want to emphasize is that when I talk to, because all of these are part of large, big collaborative teams, and this is all sequential experimentation. RL is sequential experimentation. You learn, you want to exploit, but you're still experimenting because you want to continually learn. So these are all experiments. So what are some of the challenges? Well, the state space is large, that's typical. The real problem is that the behavioral science is very immature. And so you have unknown unknowns. That is, this is not like a POM DP where we have these unobserved states that we really wish we could measure, but we know what they are. It's not like that. We don't often know what we need to measure. And in 5 years, we'll know more. So it's a very rapidly evolving field. And because that, often the reward function, the connection between the reward and the state in action, or the context in action, appears to be non-stationary, probably because you're missing aspects of the state. The treatment actions in this setting, in this mobile health setting, you would love for them to have delayed positive effects. I mean, that would be the goal. But in fact, the dominant delayed effect is negative. People get habituated, they get aggravated, they delete the app. But the effects in the near term tend to be pretty positive. You want to manage that. There's a lot of noise within a user from day to day, occasion to occasion. A lot of things are going on in users' lives, and this all adds noise to the reward. In our setting, we're interested in people who have chronic problems, mainly clinical populations, so the sample sizes don't tend to be large. I think if we get like 200-300, that'd be quite fantastic, actually. And because the behavioral field is so very immature, in order to put a study like this into the field, you have to be able to permit them to do off-policy learning. You can't allow your algorithm to end up choosing actions with probability 1 or 0, because that will prevent off-policy learning, at least for those at those times. So you need to always allow them to do off-policy learning, because they have to develop the science, the domain science. So these are the challenges you want to think about when you go. Like I try to think about really hard when I go to starting to use RL. So I'm going to talk to you now about a series of studies. Version 2 will have both, and I want to make it very clear. I'll talk to you about this physical activity study, and this physical activity study has tons of factors. I'm just going to talk to you about one factor, one treatment, one set of actions. So this is a set of 3 studies where I'll just briefly mention the results of the first study. And the second study, we call them micro-randomized, but now I'm going to say it's micro-randomized with a bandit, because I'm randomizing using a bandit. But I don't even use that word, actually. I don't use the word bandit when I talk to my collaborators. But anyhow, let's go. So I just want us to all be on the same page. On each individual, you have a time series. S denotes context, A denotes action, R denotes reward, some near-time outcome that you want to maximize, say, the sum over time. I'll show you specific examples of this. So in Heart Steps, this is the first version of Heart Steps. It was a really simple study. There was no algorithms that were running. Well, the randomization did not use an algorithm. 5 times a day, we could provide a message that would be about how you could be physically active in the moment you were in. So the content of the message comes out of sensor data. But our budget was 3 of those 5 times on average. You should get a suggestion and 2 not, on average. And that's what we're going to focus on in terms of the bandit in the next part. So I just want to give you an example of what these suggestions look like. What happens is your phone lights up, it pings, and on your notification, you get a notification such as this one. And this one occurred, it was a cold day. I was in Michigan. It was pretty cold. And it was in the morning, and it was a work day. And so the content of that notification is relevant to that context. And then I'm able to swipe this away in a number of ways. I don't like the message. I can swipe it away by pressing this. I do like the message. Or I can just turn it off for a certain number of hours. In all of these settings, the other thing to realize is these are not completely simple kind of sequential decision-making settings, because the action set does depend on the context. So the context will restrict the action set, and that happens here as well. There are certain times at which the context, like if you're driving, then we will not, under any condition, send you a notification, because if you had an accident, this would be bad. So I just want to give you some of the results, and these results indicate some of that non-stationarity and the difficulty with these types of problems. So we're talking very simple here. The action is give a tailored activity message versus don't bother the person at all. It can happen up to 5 times a day. It depends on the user when those 5 times are. It's a 42-day study, so it's around 210 times. And so after the study's over, we conducted a variety of off-policy analyses. That in itself is quite interesting because of the causal inference, but I'm not going to talk about that. I just want to talk about some of the results. So it turns out this tailored activity suggestion really increased people's step count, more than doubled it early in the study. But by midway through the study, it's a 42-day study, by day 20, there was no effect. This is clearly time in study is acting as a proxy for something we are not sensing. We're not sensing the level of habituation. The PI thinks, the investigator, the behavioral scientist thinks this is habituation, but we're not sensing that directly here. And so as a result, you see that this effect deteriorates. The connection between the reward and the context in action deteriorates with time. There were a number of features, though, that predicted succeeding 30-minute step count. This is the reward in this setting. This message was intended to impact you over the subsequent 30 minutes. And you see a list here. There could potentially be even more. And then there were a number of features that determined whether or not it was useful to provide a message. I'll just mention one in particular. At each decision time, we knew whether or not you were at home, work, or you weren't at either one of those. And it turns out if you were at other, which is neither home or work, the message really had no impact on you. And you might think, well, maybe we can do further sensing in the next study to disentangle, because it's probably because you're moving from one place to another or something, and you just don't have time, you can't act on the message. So these are the things, though, that we take into account when we start to plan the next study. And the next study is the study that's going to have the bandit doing the sequential randomization. So that's version 2. So in version 2, just like these other little pictures or schematics I showed you, there's a lot of different components being randomized. There's randomization at weekly level, on the evening, and so on. Some of them are using algorithms, but this component, whether or not to provide a tailored activity message at a particular time, this is the one that we're using the bandit for. And I just wanted to remind you, so we're on the same page. Again, these are 5 decision points. These are all people who are working, so it's according to their work schedule. And the reward is the 30-minute step count following each decision point, and the goal, of course, is to maximize the sum of rewards over, this is a 90-day study, so sum of the rewards over the 90 days. Okay, so I just made up this, it's an appallingly butchered bandit, and you'll see that. I'm positive a lot of you guys could have some great ideas about how to improve this. Okay, we're going to use a linear Thompson sampler. Now, why are we using Thompson sampling instead of UCB? We need explicit randomization. We need to be able to say, be able to calculate the randomization probability. This is just a review. I know this is a very mature area. Just so we're all on the same page, we're going to parameterize the reward by a linear combination of features of context and action. We'll initialize those parameters with a prior distribution, and then we'll calculate, every time we see a context action reward, we'll calculate the posterior distribution. It'll all be normal, so only the mean and the covariance matrix count. And then we'll select the probability, so if I were talking to someone who's used to sequential experimentation, I would say the randomization probability is determined by the posterior probability that treatment is better than no treatment, given that context. And I have that probability, right? I'm the one that calculates that probability. So I can use that in off-policy learning, that probability. So here are some of the challenges and what we are trying to do. And as I said, I mean, if you're interested in RL and you have ideas, I would love to hear people's thoughts on this. So the data is very noisy, and that's what pushed us towards the bandit. We didn't really want to do a bandit. So I'm going to explain why I say that. So the bandit algorithms, Satinder Singh has some really nice work where he shows that even if your objective is you have a large discount rate, even say I want to maximize the average reward over 42 days or 92 days, you would use, so that would be like a discount rate of 1. You still use a lower discount rate because you learn faster. So in a sense, what the bandit's doing is extreme regularization here, because we're using a discount rate of 0, right? We're being greedy. And what we're doing is we're trading bias and variance. And that's to deal with the noisy data. And also we deal with the noisy data by using, well, this is not quite true and you'll see why, but at least at first shot you might think to use a low dimensional parameterization. And then our prior will come directly from the prior study, the study we just ran. So that's the whole idea. There'll be a third study, and we'll have an even better prior then. And I really want to do full-scale RL in that third study. It'll be a year-long study. Did I miss something? Oh, right. So non-stationarity, I already gave you some evidence that we're not sensing the entire context, the entire state. And so one way to do this is instead of using just a straight Gaussian prior, we'll use a Gaussian process prior. What does a Gaussian process prior do? What it does is it just exponentially discounts the past. So you only use the more recent data to learn, to change the probabilities of choosing a particular action. The other issue, of course, which goes against everything I just finished saying, is that the immediate effects, that immediate reward you tend to have a positive impact on the immediate reward, but you tend to have a negative impact on the longer term rewards. And we saw that with Heart Steps 1. You know, you have this great impact on the immediate reward, but longer term, people habituate and they stop responding. So in fact, the concern here is the algorithm will learn to always treat, yet always treat wouldn't produce the highest overall best, it's not the best policy.
Do you have a separate bandit algorithm for states?
No, we're using the features, we're using like a linear, you'll see an example. You'll see. Hold that question, okay? But so what are we doing? We're going to add, I won't go into this because I want to talk to you about something else instead, but what we're going to do is to the reward, we're going to add a low variance proxy for the value function. I'll just state briefly what that is. So what we do is we know that your past, how many times we've been notifying you in the past, appears to be a proxy for habituation and burden. If we bother you a lot, you tend to habituate. So what we do is we create a deterministic MDP. Well, it's not completely deterministic, but it only includes exogenous states that are not impacted by actions. We create that kind of MDP. We use that as our value, our proxy value. So it's a very low proxy value, but it penalizes us if we treat you too much. In a year, I'll know how it turned out. So this is the one, so we'll continue on. I'll give you the, let me see, there was one. Okay, great. So we have to ensure off-policy learning. We know that. We know we're going to want to do causal inference because we have to be able to do, we have to be able to run algorithms after the study's over that advance the behavioral science. So that's one of the reasons why we use Thompson sampling as compared to UCB. And we also force the probability of choosing no treatment, no push, to be between 0.2 and 0.9. So you always have a minimal amount of exploration here. I'd like to get rid of that if we can eventually, but then the algorithm has to really pick up the non-stationarity and not accidentally go to 0 and 1. The expected reward, I mean, we're going to use a linear functional, but we recognize that it's probably a very complex function of the context. These are some step counts. I just put this here. So what we're going to do is we are doing this. We're centering the treatment. So in this case, this simple bandit problem, the action set is 0 and 1. 0 if we don't push, 1 if we push this tailored activity message. What we're going to do is we're going to subtract from A, which is 1 if you push, 0 not. We're going to subtract the probability of treating. Okay, and this goes back, if you have friends in economics, it's sort of connected to instrumental variables. If you know about classical experimental design, it's connected to contrast coding. So it has its basis in a lot of old areas of science. What does that do for us? Well, first I'll show you what I mean, and then I'll tell you what it does for us. So originally I said we would just parameterize the reward as a linear combination of some features of context and action. This is what you asked me. But now what we'll do is we'll replace that by some function that doesn't involve action. You can think of this as sort of like an advantage, if you're familiar with that term in RL. And this function involves the action, which is binary, and it's always centered. So what does this gain? What do we gain by doing this? What we do is we produce orthogonality between this part, and as a consequence, we don't have to get the baseline reward function correct. It can be non-stationary, it can be arbitrarily complex, and we still get good regret bounds, standard type regret bounds. So normally we know with bandit algorithms, when you have an adversarial state selection, the worst case scenario is like t. You learn it, but here you still get square root t. So, and it's because of this centering. Okay, we'll just use some proxy to try and reduce variance for this, but we don't have to assume that it's correct. I just wanted to show you some picture of that square root t versus t regret. So here you can see we just had a very simple model where we used a linear model for the baseline, the whole Thompson sampler, but the true underlying reward model was nonlinear, and we ran a regular standard Thompson sampler, and you see how the regret increases very strongly, but with the action centered, it flattens out, and it's because you only need to get the advantage part correct. You don't need to get the whole reward function correct. Okay, so this study is going into the field. The team's pretty much done. It'll either go in this month or next month. So there's a big question. There's a lot of ad hocery going on. That's why I call it a butchered bandit. And here's one question that comes up, and I would really like to receive feedback if people have ideas. So what we really want is a continually learning app. Here's a setting where the algorithm, the learning algorithm, will be part of the intervention, part of the treatment. And that seems so simple. We already do this, for example, and we're trying to do this with autonomous cars and autonomous helicopter flight. But in the health arena, this is a different ball game because you actually have humans you're going to have this algorithm running on. So we want to, when we roll this out, say like Kaiser, if Kaiser, this is a big health maintenance organization in the States, if they roll this out, with that app, they would roll out the algorithm. And you might have intermittent batch analyses that would occur, but the algorithm is part and parcel of that app, that learning algorithm. Of course, it's going to have to make structural assumptions to trade bias and variance. And you saw me do this in a very gross way. I used a bandit in a setting in which I know I have very strong delayed effects. So I really traded bias and variance. So there's going to always be some structural assumptions which just don't quite make sense in order to trade bias and variance in these settings. So the kind of algorithm that you'd want to put into this app, it's going to have to satisfy multiple goals. You want it to track the best policy. Notice my language. I didn't say learn the best policy because I actually don't think that makes sense. In this setting, I think we want to track the best policy because these are non-stationary settings. And you also want to permit intermittent, say, for example, every 3 months or every month, there would be an off-policy analysis, a protocol for where you'd do off-policy analyses. And these inferences would be causal in nature, so you have to be able to permit them to be causal in nature. They might concern very different outcomes from the reward. This is already happening to us left and right with these studies that even the three studies I showed you on these schematics, that people have other types of rewards that they're interested in. And you need to be able to allow them to do analytics or machine learning on those other types of outcomes. They want to use different structural assumptions. So whatever structural assumptions we use to trade bias and variance in our learning algorithm, it should not mess up their ability to do their off-policy analyses. So we always protect these intermittent. A lot of these intermittent analyses might actually check the quality of our algorithm so that we could update our algorithm in fact. So here was it took me a long time to even make the slide I made on the last page. And so then I start to think, well, what is that? We really want, you're theoreticians. Our goal is to take these kind of real life problems and to make them into mathematical problems so that we can see with clarity what we're trying to optimize. And so here's one effort. Maybe minimize finite t regret subject to bounds. So like I could have a series of off-policy analyses that I know they're important and are probably difficult to address. I preserve the power to address those off-policy analyses. So I want to minimize my regret subject to sufficient power. That might be one way. What we're doing in our study, sort of by accident, is we're attempting to minimize finite t regret subject to bounds on our exploration policy. In other words, our exploration, remember I said the probabilities had to be between 0.1 and 0.8. And that's a very crude, incredibly crude way. So how might you have multiple objectives, this learning algorithm that you want to put this out in. We work both with companies, so this might be in a commercial setting, it might be in a health maintenance setting, but you want to roll these out, and you want your algorithm to satisfy certain, or target at least, at a minimum, target certain optimality criteria. How do you frame that? It would be great to hear what people have to say. And this is my last slide. I just wanted to mention these types of studies. I don't even have like most of the people, because I've listed 3 studies in this one, and there's a lot of human-computer interaction guys, a lot of engineers because of the sensors. A lot of the sensors are proprietary; they're not commercial that are used in these studies. A lot of computer scientists and so on, behavioral scientists. Everybody has to work on these kind of problems, work together. Thank you.
All right, thank you for an interesting talk. We have time for questions.
Uh-huh.
And I can think about two kinds of habituation.
Mm-hmm.
One that you seem to sort of hint at is that someone gets used to the notifications and then ignores them and no longer responds to them. So, so the long-term effect is small. But I can also imagine that the use of the app causes a new baseline.
Right.
Causes a fundamental difference in behavior. So I'm asking, like, what happens when you do that?
Right, right. So that's, so of course, my colleagues, my behavioral science colleagues, this is what we all wanted originally. We wanted to create new habits. That would be the positive delayed effects. And then there'd be immediate positive effects because we'd give you an actionable suggestion in the moment. The problem is the negative effects, the signal to the negative effect of habituation, the negative type of habituation and burden, it's so much stronger, it washes out everything. And in fact, now that made us shift what we've been doing. I don't know if I have this on the next slide. So now what we're doing is we're running studies where all of our actions are engagement actions to help people stay engaged. And this is with substance abusing young kids, adolescents, and young adults. And here it's all about how do we help you overcome the contingencies of the moment? How do we add enough reinforcer in the moment so that you will act in your best long-term interest, what you really want to do? But all these things are happening to you in the moment. You know how it is. I mean, you see a brownie in front of you and you know you shouldn't eat it and you do it anyway, right? That's what we're talking about. So so now we're doing studies where it's all engagement. So the future, I think, is we'll have a policy that has both engagement actions and therapeutic actions. And they'll have to intertwine. And I don't know how we're going to, the future is extremely exciting because you both have actions that are at the weekly level, within the day level. They're at different time scales. They have different rewards. How do you put that together? Of course, yeah.
Yes, John?
Are there ethical considerations that you come across in your work that you think the theory community would benefit from exploring in a sort of more fundamental way? Stuff that these algorithms suggest for future research?
Well, of course, you have to be really careful with the data, right? The encryption of the data. It has to be HIPAA compliant, which is a regulatory thing in the US. But in terms of, right now, I think long term there will, if we were selling, so there are some, I've had a number of companies want to work with me in physical activity, but the way they're monetizing the whole thing is by doing ads, by using ads. And I think there are a lot of ethics concerns, right? Because in a way they want you to get addicted, so then you see their ads, and so there's real ethical issues here. I haven't seen that as much. The big issue is more that we interrupt you. The only ethical issue, well, the primary ethical issue that we've been concerned with is that somehow will distract you and you'll end up hurting yourself. So that's one of the reasons why we have a classifier that tells us whether or not you're moving very fast. And if you are, then you might be driving, so we won't send a message. But I could imagine a much more sophisticated version where you really try and detect the context in which delivering any kind of content or certain types of content may harm someone. Now, I'm also working in suicide, and there's a lot of issues that go on, and you have to be really careful, but that's a slightly different area. Yeah.
Yes, Peter?
So I'm wondering, are there any meta-trials studies to see whether this works in the long run at all? Because this delayed cognition delay, I think it seems to be very ambitious in a way to get this really working.
Yeah.
How do people do 2 years after they participated?
Well, okay, so this is a really interesting topic. Well, I'm hoping I'm going to interpret. He asked me, how do you know 2 years after a study like this whether or not it did you any good? I think that's what you're asking me. Yeah, so I used to think like that too. I used to think, well, you know, we want to cure these people. But then I had this really interesting conversation with Rich Sutton. And I'm not going to take words out of his mouth. So whatever I'm saying is my view of what he said, okay? But first of all of the areas we work in are chronic disorders. At this time, we know we have no magic blue pill. There's no cure to any of the kinds of areas we work in. So Rich and I first had this idea, okay, we're going to try and really help people have these develop positive habits. That's the way I was thinking. And then Rich pointed out, you and I are walking around and we're telling the time. None of us know how to use the sun to tell the time anymore. It's appalling. We have lost that skill. We have offloaded that skill to our watch. This is appalling. Let's offload a lot of these lower level cognitive, just automated processes to an app. What's wrong with that? I mean, as long as you have to think of the ethics here. But a watch is a tool, a digital tool that we use to offload telling the time from the sun. In the same way, you could imagine a future in which we have more time to do more interesting thinking because our phone reminds us when we have to take our medication, or our phone reminds us. Right now, my phone tells me every day what I should do. I love this, man, and I don't want it to ever stop. So he had this view of having this being a tool that you could offload lower level processing to, and you would never potentially take it away. Instead of curing, supporting, yeah. Yeah, but the whole goal, but that's the key here. The key is how do we, so a lot of the HCI world, human-computer interaction, is about how we sense in very unobtrusive ways that you're starting to habituate, that you're starting to get aggravated. And actually, some of our team now, we're working with Jim Ray at Georgia Tech on feature construction using a whole variety of sensor streams where it's a latent feature of engagement. And the idea is if you reach a certain threshold, then we may have to change things. So you might have higher level sequential decisions. You know, you have sequential decisions going on at multiple levels. And depending on the severity of the disorder, it may even involve a clinic. Like in diabetes, you could very well imagine that some of the very highest level sequential decisions would involve contacts with a clinic. Yeah.
So some people are very motivated by competition. And so I can imagine they have to, either because you were in competition with yourself, or might you
Right.
12 miles last week, or someone else saying, your sister walked 12 miles this week, you can do 13, right?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if the learning algorithms you have for deciding when to push, for instance, will they adapt directly to this kind of competitive app?
Definitely that's what, I mean, you know that's very popular right now, particularly with physical activity apps. And with a lot of apps for adolescents, they do this as well. Right now we're working on how you pool. So a big issue in this study, like the bandit I showed you, the prior comes from pooled data and the first week of the study prior to the beginning of any kind of actions, provision of actions. But from then on, the bandit operates separately on each individual. Why are we doing this? Because after the study, we need to be able to do off-policy learning. And if you pool data between subjects during a study, you create dependence. And a lot of the standard analytics that your colleagues use hinge on it. So right now we are working on, there's this whole area of survey data collection where you have a lot of this type of funny grouped data where you get this, the actions that the experimenter takes produces dependence. There's not inherent dependence particularly. Now, that's one area, but I'm talking about the setting where the actions produce dependence. And there are these ways of increasing the standard deviation measures of variance. And we're working on that right now. How can we inflate the measures of variance for off-policy analyses that will allow us to adjust for the fact that we created an apparent dependence by telling you about people you're competing with? Of course, if you're doing a physical activity study or like an addiction, we often have people clustered into groups, and there you pull within a group, and that one group is one sequential decision-making problem. The next group is another sequential decision-making problem. The next group is another. I wouldn't, right now, these are very exciting things to work on, but because of the stakeholders that are involved in these kind of studies, we have to make sure that everyone gets to be able to develop their science. We have to make sure behavioral science gets developed. So certainly, I think it's coming soon. The investigator of Heart Steps wanted to run one of these pooled studies, and I told him no, we wouldn't, because I want so bad to manage my reputation in that field and get the buy-in, because I've been able to get these kind of studies in the field. So I myself am conservative, right? I'm always protecting their science.
So actually, following up on this question, you mentioned that you start creating dependencies across users, but you have natural temporal dependencies that you've been neglecting when you were doing this thing. But if I do the off-policy analysis, most of the causal inference actually does not know how to handle time-dependent data.
Right. So I was going to talk about that today, and I thought, well, I'll go on, and y'all will all go to sleep. So I didn't. But so this is another idea I got off of poor old Rich, which we don't want to blame Rich for if I messed it up, okay? And that's this idea of excursions. I don't know if anybody has thought about this. So if you're in a continually learning setting, when you think of causal inference off policy, you're often thinking, I got to this point in time under a particular policy. Now I want to compare different excursions that I might follow in the future. And those excursions could be time limited. And you only have enough information in the data to make certain really good inference about certain excursions, or you get too much variance. So for example, I could, and in fact in that Sense to Stop, that smoking study, the primary analysis in the off-policy setting is an excursion. So in that setting, we have, at every point in time we ask, what if we take the excursion of not treating you now and not treating you for 2 hours? How will that outcome look? Versus not treating you now and not treating you for the next 2 hours. Those are two different policies. So your excursions are different policies, and at each time you ask, which of those two policies might I follow? So if we were going to roll this out in real life, like with Kaiser, which is really where I want to go. I mean, this is my, those intermittent analyses I think are going to be about excursions. And we'll always be asking, if we change how we're proceeding using a way A versus using way B, can we anticipate what the difference in rewards would be? I agree, you can't, if you can't have excursions that last hundreds of time steps, because the importance weights, they just blow up. You're dead. But the good thing here is we do have randomization, and we know what those probabilities are. So at least we can adjust for the probabilities in some ways. And then in secondary analyses, we can make certain structural assumptions. But those are assumptions.
Do you mean to collapse different histories?
Yeah, to collapse over histories, yeah.
All right, so, yeah, maybe one last question?
Sorry, I have a question about delay effect.
Mm-hmm.
So, as me, I agree that I sometimes pick up my push notification in my smartphone. However, that's about in a clinical application, people must do kind of exercise. So just pushing, it can be really efficient to remind, oh, I need to do exercise.
Right.
So is it really, suppressing, pushing can benefit?
Oh, definitely. Oh, without a doubt. I mean, people who have chronic disorders, let's think of a diabetic. Every day they have 21 things, around 21 things they have to do every day to take care of themselves. Every day of their life. This gets so old, so fast, it is unreal. They know that the consequences are horrendous, but still they go and eat that donut every now and then. Or they do what, and so I'm not, I don't want to take away the donut, but you want to reduce the rate at which you make poor decisions. You still will make poor, we want to be free people, we want to have a good life, we want to have quality in our life. But if you can reduce the rate at which I do self-harm accidentally, that's aligned with my goals, my longer-term goals. People, it's really quite sad, actually, how much non-adherence, that's what they call it in the medical field, people don't take meds that they're supposed to. They'll have a chronic, they have high blood pressure. Most people stop taking meds very fast. It's really a big problem. And we know we need it. We know we do.
Okay, so we're out of time, so join me in thanking Susan for both great talk and a stimulating discussion.